Good day, everyone, and welcome back to Give the People What They Want. I'm your host, Zoe Alexandra, and as always, I'm excited to be joined by my co-hosts, Roger McKenzie, the international editor of Morningstar News, and Prasanth, an Indian journalist. We have a lot of news to get to today: ceasefire talks, dialogues, back and forth, broken promises, and even national strikes. So we're going to get to that and more.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
Well, Roger, in the past couple of months, you've been guiding us through understanding what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, Trump's promises, not promises, peace talks, if they're leading to anything. And last week, obviously, saw some major developments. So tell us what happened in Alaska. Tell us what happened in DC. Is there going to be peace?
Who knows when Trump's involved physically? But I mean, it's been an incredible few days actually. So last Friday, of course, we saw a massive summit between Putin and Trump, and I deliberately put it that way around because I think it was really clear to anybody watching who the leader of that conversation really was. Russia dominated that conversation, and I think one of the most important things about that conversation in Alaska last week was the way that we have now moved beyond any talk of a ceasefire or any ceasefire deal, but we've actually moved towards talks about a peace, and I think that's really significant. So Russia is just saying, let's get to the core of the issues that forced the special military operation in the first place. So clearly, some sort of deal was done. Last week, there was all sorts of rumors flying around. The only thing that we really knew that was going to happen was that there was going to be this meeting with Zelensky in the White House on Monday. Then it started to emerge that the Europeans started waving their hands around and saying, we need to be involved as well, because, by the way, we're the ones who stopped all this this peace deal from happening all those months ago in the first place. So we need to be there. So they dropped everything that was important to them in going on in their countries and hightailed it across the Atlantic to be humiliated, frankly, with this iconic picture of them sitting in front of Trump's desk, being essentially told what their future was, really. And for me, that says everything about the relationship between the Europeans and the Trump-led United States. Essentially, we will tell you what to do, and your job is just to ask us how high you want us to go and how high you want us to jump, basically. So what was actually agreed? Well, it seems as though part of the deal, as I've said, is we're moving towards real talks about a genuine cessation of hostilities rather than a ceasefire, and I think that's important. But it seems so. What's that all going to be based around? It looks as though there's going to be a realization that the land that Russia has won on the battlefield is not going to be given away, not going to be given back by Russia to Ukraine, and that means that Ukraine and the Europeans are going to have to accept that reality of life. And one of the things that's been talked about is security guarantees. Really not clear about who those security guarantees are going to be provided by. First of all, Trump said, well, the United States will play a leading role in these security guarantees. The next day he came back on and said, well, we won't be putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. Very sensible thing to do as well, not to put US troops on the ground in Ukraine. Apart from anything else, would not be accepted by Russia. Neither would troops from any of the NATO countries be accepted, frankly, in Ukraine. The whole reason for the conflict in the first place was the eastward expansion of NATO. So why would Russia accept those troops on the ground again? It's simply not going to happen. So what seems to be the case now is that there's behind the scenes talks taking place about what those security guarantees might look like. But then part of the other discussion is to look at is to try and set up a direct meeting between really senior people from Russia and Ukraine. Not clear whether that's going to be Putin and Zelensky at this stage. Could be Lavrov, the equivalent in Ukraine at this stage, but that's certainly being talked about, and that could happen really quickly. If the level of those discussions is raised, then I think we're on for some sort of agreement, because essentially I think the US has said we want out of this. And I think Trump is playing to his MAGA base that that they all want out. They don't want to put any more money into this conflict. So we're going to see over the next few days, Zoe, about where this is going to go. But I think we've got every reason to be optimistic, frankly, that we're in the kind of, if not the end throes, then certainly the beginning of the end, I think, of this process. And I think the US has had enough. I think the only danger that we could see now is that there could be, there could be some sort of false flag by the Ukrainians to try and scupper the whole deal. But in the end, I think we're going to see more discussions over the next few weeks, and I think we're seeing progress towards some kind of final peace deal.
Well, Roger, I certainly hope you're right, especially given what you said at the beginning, that with Trump, who's to say what's going to happen? So we'll definitely be following that as always. Prasanth, to move to another war zone, a war that has a little bit less optimism than perhaps these recent talks with Russia and Ukraine. Sudan has been now several years in this civil war, mass humanitarian devastation. Now there's another level to it. Take us there.
Right, so we're talking about the cholera crisis that has gripped Sudan, especially the Darfur region. And this was recently flagged by Doctors Without Borders, that is MSF, who pointed out that the country, especially that region, has been going through a severe epidemic, hundreds of cases coming in. And I believe when they released the report somewhere around last week, they said that 40 people had died in a week of cholera. Now, it's important to note that cholera is an easily treatable disease. It's an easily preventable disease, and it's an easily treatable disease. The fact that people are dying of a disease which is spread through contaminated food and water, primarily water, means that even the most basic facilities are not available to those affected by the war in Sudan. And it's no surprise, because the kind of conflict that is being waged in Sudan right now is a full-fledged war on the people. A lot of media reports, paint it as a war between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, which it is, there's no doubt about it. But ultimately, this is the kind of war which has been, in which targeting the people is a very, very clear part of the battle strategy, or whatever you call it, for both sections. So, for instance, we know that in the North Darfur province, the city of El Fasher, which is the capital of that province, has been under siege for almost a year. There's a Zamzam refugee camp nearby, which is also besieged. People's Dispatch has a lot of excellent coverage of what happened during those sieges. We saw how hundreds of thousands of people were forced to leave these areas. So from the refugee camp, they went to El Fasher. El Fasher is under siege itself. There's been numerous, famine has been reported a number of times. People, again, hundreds of thousands of people fleeing there to even smaller towns. And it's from there that the MSF reported as the town of Tawila, where they said that nearly 380,000 people have fled from El Fasher to this small town. And the medical facilities, they're completely overwhelmed, incapable of dealing with this kind of mass crisis. As you know, when a conflict of this kind takes place, people, I think the overall refugee count, because the war has been somewhere around 12 million or so. And you have all these massive numbers of people trying to somehow find a place to stay, some kind of shelter, and are thus exposed to contaminated water, which is what causes disease in the first place. Children, of course, are suffering greatly because of this. And in addition to this, there's, for instance, reports of, in El Fasher, you're talking about food prices soaring to such an insane extent that what used to suffice for 1 week, the amount of food you could buy for 1 week that amount of with that money, you can buy just one meal at this point of time in many parts of the place. And you also, for instance, have apparently reports of people resorting to eating animal feed in order to sustain themselves, because that whole region is under siege by the RSF. And I think there have been about 100,000 cases of cholera since the war began in the country. And like I said, I think it's important to note that the fact that cholera is what is causing this amount of chaos is really, it really shows the extent of the torture, the way the people are being the war is being waged on the people at this point, because it's really a disease that can so easily be prevented. And we've already talked about it in the past that the war has kind of ground to this it's almost like a standstill at this point. The Sudanese army is consolidated in some areas, the rapid support forces is consolidated in some others. There's a fresh battlefield that has kind of opened up in the southern part of the country, in the Kordofan provinces. Both sides have declared their own governments. And most analysts are now afraid that there might be some kind of a de facto partition of the country, which would basically just lead to this, both sides digging in and this war continuing in this manner, because clearly the international community has no major real motivation to actually stop this war. We have, for instance, countries like the UAE, which are viscerally involved in this war because all Sudan's gold is right now going to the UAE at this point, and it's handsomely benefiting out of it in multiple ways. So we have this massive crisis. Aid, just the amount of aid is absolutely not enough. Aid also being blockaded by armed groups. So right now, an extremely scary and a very, very tragic situation in Sudan as people deal with this cholera crisis.
It's definitely a very worrying situation, and one that happens when a place has been under siege for so long, as we see the spread of disease as well in Gaza. We know that the only way to actually have real health for all and access to health is for these wars to end. And so, disease and sickness is really part and parcel of having such a devastating war across the entire country. Well, bringing it back to another country that loves to wage war abroad and at home, National Guard troops, members have been deployed in the capital city of the United States, Washington, D.C. They've been there now for just about a week, essentially to show presence. There's over 1,000 of them deployed across Washington, D.C. Reportedly, again, in the words of Trump, to stop the scourge of violent crime that's taking place across the Capitol. Notably, crime has actually gone down in the Capitol, but essentially we have these, dozens, hundreds of members of the National Guard, and even ones coming from other states. About 6 Republican states have actually pledged to send a couple hundred of their National Guard members to Washington, D.C. again to help fight crime, quote unquote. And what we've seen actually is kind of an increase in arrests of, surprise, surprise, of immigrants, of Black people in D.C. D.C. is a historically Black city. Of course, many people being pushed out because of gentrification, but again, it has this history. Basically these troops are kind of all across the major parts of the city. Reportedly, they don't actually have the ability to fully arrest someone. That is the job of the police, but they are able to detain someone, hand them off to the police. So essentially you have a bolstering of security forces in Washington, D.C. who are able to essentially arrest anyone. There was a video of a delivery worker who was detained reportedly because he looked scared. They said, well, why you look scared? And started to detain him. Turns out he's an immigrant, and they began to process him. So arrests like these are taking place kind of across the city, and it's kind of crazy because it's very clear how these are racially targeted, how they're, of course, have this whole kind of political angle to them. Oh, we're going to fight crime, aka fight kind of the poor and working class people of DC. Yet at the same time, we still see this kind of furor amongst the right wing, kind of capitalizing on this moment to say, see, we're going to fight crime in this democratic city. We're even going to send resources. I mean, in a lot of ways, this kind of abandoning any sort of commitment to your own people just to fight this kind of ideological battle. We're seeing it in a lot of places. So it's quite disturbing. This kind of occupation, as it's being called, of Washington, D.C. is going to continue. I'm sure we're going to see more statements coming out, more illegal arrests, more targeted arrests of Black and people and immigrants, which is, of course, extremely concerning, very disturbing, but it's also creating a lot of fight back. So there's been a lot of protests against these checkpoints, against the arrests that are happening. So we'll be following that. Please check it out on People's Dispatch because it is a developing story. That brings us to the middle of our show. If you're not doing it already, go to your phone, go to your computer, follow People's Dispatch on Twitter. Sorry, a little old school, on X, on Instagram, on all of the social media platforms we have, on Telegram. Follow Morningstar. Check out our websites, bookmark them. Make sure you're checking it every day because we are working very, very hard to bring you the news that you need to hear. News from a different perspective that you won't hear elsewhere. Where else are you going to get the news of what the trade unions are doing across the UK? Such a strong trade union culture. Morningstar is going to bring it to you every single day. People's Dispatch, stories from Latin America, stories from Africa, stories from Asia. Again, you won't get this coverage elsewhere. So make sure you're following us. And of course, make sure you're following this show. Every Wednesday, we come out with a new episode. Last week, unfortunately, we were not able to, but we have made this promise to you. We will keep recording. We will keep telling you this news that you need to hear, and hopefully in a perspective that you aren't hearing elsewhere, and you know, in an interesting way. So make sure you're following that. And let's get back to you, Prasanth. The last week, again, in Palestine has continued to have new developments. Take us there. Any hope there?
Right. You know, there has been some talk of a ceasefire, which Israel is now stalling, of course. But the more, I think, this one of the more significant developments is the fact that Israel has intensified its assault, if that is even possible, with the announcement that it is going to occupy Gaza City and you know, what do you call it, displace nearly, I think, about 1 million people to central part of Gaza as part of its stated aims or whatever. Now, there's an important move in some senses. It shows how bankrupt the Israeli government's policies is. In fact, there's been a lot of opposition within Israel itself to this idea. Of course, not enough opposition that the fundamental logic of occupation and invasion and genocide be challenged, of course, but more of a self-preserving kind of opposition within Israel itself. But the Netanyahu government has gone ahead nonetheless with the proposal. We're hearing daily reports of attacks intensifying in Gaza City, which is in the northern part of the Gaza Strip of the territory itself. And you know, again, like I said, there's been horrible reports of attacks on those seeking aid. Of course, last week we heard about the death, the martyrdom of journalist Anas al-Sharif. I think more than, according to the officials in Gaza, plus 250 plus journalists have been killed by now, which is really, really horrible record. And again, talking about these journalists, it's very difficult to talk about these journalists, because when you read the recollections of their colleagues, what you kind of see is this unbelievable commitment to keep talking about, to keep writing about, to keep speaking about what is happening, to keep speaking about the genocide that is taking place every day, despite hunger, despite the death of their relatives. In the case of Anas al-Sharif, I think a year before, his own father had been killed in a bombing. He had faced multiple threats from Israeli authorities. There had been, Israeli authorities had released videos specifically threatening him. International agencies had pointed to those threats and said that, hey, look, this journalist is in danger. This is not right. And still Israel was able to go and murder a journalist who actually spent his entire lifetime, who gave his life talking the truth, speaking the truth. So and it's very very difficult for journalists like us to kind of watch what is happening right now, but also equally important that we keep talking about not only the death of journalists, but the death of those seeking aid, the death of people every day who are just somehow trying to survive while Netanyahu is pursuing his war for his own political and genocidal goals. So that's what's been happening on in Gaza itself. Globally, it's a mixed bag. I mean, like I said, there's been some talk of truce. Whether it will take off or not, we really don't know. The key questions remain. The fundamental question is whether, alongside the immediate ceasing of fire, whether there be some movement towards redeployment of Israeli soldiers, or even some movement towards discussing a longer-term peace. From the looks of it, Netanyahu is absolutely not interested in that right now. He does seem to want to push this current operation to the maximum, to its maximum, whereby he placates his right-wing allies, ensures the stability of his government and his political future, and just cites a hostage as an excuse at this point. So, on the other hand, we do see that the protests that really have been one of the few sources of hope and light during this point have continued across the world. Today, I believe, or 2 days ago, there was a big protest in South Africa. On Saturday, there was a huge protest in the United States, tens of thousands of people again marching in New York, a diverse group of organizations, a huge coalition coming together to once again reject the occupation and genocide, reject the US government's position of it. And I think it's these kind of protests really that give some hope at this point of time. These kind of protests and the resistance by Palestinian journalists, by ordinary Palestinians, that gives some kind of hope that this machine of genocide, this machine of killing, can at some point be stopped.
And we keep on fighting for that. Well, we're going to end with a happy note. I'll just say that. But right now, we're going to move to another unfortunate defeat, which happened on Sunday in Bolivia. There were general elections held in the Andean country. And, well, the results shocked many, or weren't shocking, but were confirmation of trends that people had observed. On Sunday, it was the first round of the presidential elections, and the two people who advanced to the next round were not anyone from the movement toward socialism, did not come from the social movement in Bolivia, but actually were two right-wing candidates. And this ends kind of the nearly 2-decade rule of the movement toward socialism in Bolivia. This, of course, is a party, but it represented a broader kind of movement in the country, a movement led by the indigenous people, by the trade unions, pushing for change, pushing for Bolivia to break out of its neoliberal nightmare, led, of course, by kind of the white minority. Bolivia is a deeply indigenous country where indigenous people had long been excluded. And so for the first time, an indigenous president had been elected, Evo Morales. Of course, he was couped in 2019. There's a lot that happened between then. Luis Arce came to power in 2020 after a prolonged struggle, demanding elections. And, well, there's been a lot of commentary, of course, on the progressive circles and left circles online about kind of the political feud that emerged between Luis Arce and Evo Morales in terms of who was going to be the candidate. At the end of the day, neither of them were. Evo was barred from running. Luis Arce lost a lot of popularity because of kind of the economic crisis facing the country and other reasons. And so for the first time, there are going to be two right-wing candidates facing off in the elections in October. It marks really a tremendous setback, not only for Bolivia, but for the region, a break in the continuity of this project, a defeat and an end to this project temporarily, and really kind of a sign to other countries in the region that there's a lot of factors that can lead to defeat, and that building a strong movement, building new instruments of the state is actually fundamental to reshaping it, and to not kind of falling into these petty disagreements. That's, of course, one of the aspects that led to this kind of split of the left vote. And then, of course, in these elections, Evo Morales, because he was barred from running, he called for the blank vote. This vote actually got about 20% of the vote, which is notable. None of the kind of leftish candidates got more than 10% of the vote. So really, it's a tremendous setback. I know that people are still kind of poring over the results, analyzing it, looking at the last 20 years in Bolivia, what went wrong, what went right, how to avoid this in the future. A lot of countries in Latin America where there are progressive leaders still kind of are stuck in this liberal bourgeois state. There are some exceptions, of course, Venezuela, Cuba, who have attempted to transform the instruments of the state. But anyways, it leaves this big question, which I think a lot of us are thinking about, which is how do you actually consolidate one of these projects? And Bolivia gave a lot of lessons about, what can go wrong. Of course, Argentina as well gave this lesson. So a lot to think about. I know a lot of people are kind of thinking about it from a lot of different angles. Wanted to give a couple of grains of salt on that. And finally, let's end on a happy note, because there's been a lot of war, a lot of setbacks, a lot of defeats. Roger, tremendous strike action taking place across Canada. Tell us a little more.
Yeah, it was. It really is important that we find these rays of light at the end of what sometimes can be a really dark tunnel, I think. And we've seen that with Air Canada. So for months now, there's been attempts by the Canadian Union of Public Employees to negotiate a new contract with Air Canada. Air Canada has stalled those negotiations, and last week, CUPE members, flight attendants on Air Canada walked out. And they made it clear they weren't going back until there was progress made around the bargaining table again. And they were really clear, that this isn't going to be solved elsewhere. This will be solved around the bargaining table. Now, like they've done elsewhere, the Canadian government then decided that what they were going to do was to instruct those workers to go back to work and take part in a mandatory kind of arbitration. And the workers decided, no, we're not going to do that. We are staying out. We are going to stay on strike. We're going to exercise our right to withdraw our labour. And that's what they did. And then what happened was that the arbitration board, the Canadian Labour Relations Board, I think it's called, decided to declare the strike illegal. Now, that's massive, and in a lot of places across the world that would mean that the workers would go back to work. That did not happen here. The workers said, we are not prepared to be treated like that. We are going to stay out on strike. And that threw the whole thing into turmoil, so that the government didn't know what to do. Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, who we know a lot about from Britain, because he was the head of the Bank of England over here for a while, and somehow goes back home to Canada and becomes Prime Minister. I mean, it's just how capitalism works. That's a great example. There are no barriers for the way that these people can flip from one job to the next. But he was then sort of going into one about, this is terrible. This is going to harm the economy, and particularly with the way that the Labour Relations Board declared the strike illegal. But by the end of that day, the Air Canada was forced to come back around the bargaining table, which was what CUPE wanted in the first place, and then within hours they'd reached a deal. Now, one of the most important parts of this deal, and it's something that a lot of workers who work in the air industry, so like flight attendants and pilots, have to put up with, is what happens in those times when you're not actually flying, because most flight attendants just get paid for when the flight takes off and when it lands. So all the preparation that goes on beforehand, they don't get paid for. All the stuff that they have to do after the flight's landed, they don't get paid for. And they were reasonably saying, well, we should be paid for this on top of our regular salary. The great news is they won that battle. So now the proposal is that they are going to be paid for that. We don't know the exact details of it, but CUPE came out after the negotiations and said, you will never have to work for nothing again, because that's such a good explanation about what was happening. Workers, these flight attendants, were being expected to work for nothing, and it looks as though they've won that battle. The contract will have to be finally approved, obviously, by the members. And there's some examples in the past where members haven't always accepted the deal that's been negotiated by their union. So we'll have to wait and see what the outcome is. But the great news is that those members stood firm. They stood up and said, this is what we want, and we are prepared to stay out, and no matter what hardship it is for us. And a lot of the news was about the hardship on passengers and so on. Well, it's a hardship on those workers, and they said, we are prepared to stand up and make our claim, and we're prepared to stay out on strike. And it looks as though they've won that battle. So congratulations to all those flight attendants who stood up and said, no more, and we're not going to continue to give our labor for free.
Definitely a tremendous victory, and hopefully we'll have ripples and impacts across the industry, because as you said, nobody should be working for free. That brings us to the end of this week's episode. Thank you once again for following us. Make sure you're following Morningstar News and People's Dispatch on all social media platforms. As I said, bookmark our websites, read it every morning, and we'll be back with you next week with more stories.